IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to today's episode of All Things Policy. So as you may have already read, this month marked the first anniversary of the Galwan Valley clash between China and India, which resulted in the deaths of 20 Indians and at least 4 PLA soldiers. It also marked the first fatalities on the line of actual control in over 45 years, resulting from China's attempts to change the status quo forcefully in Ladakh. Galwan Valley clash on the night of 15 June last year shattered 3 decades of trust and confidence established by 5 pacts signed between the years of 1993 and 2012. In the days that followed, both sides deployed over 2 army divisions, battle tanks, self-propelled howitzers, and surface-to-air missiles to Ladakh. Both sides also deployed fighters, surveillance and reconnaissance aircraft and drones at forward bases near the border. Today, after 13 months of friction, 11 rounds of Corps Commander level meetings, 7 work mechanism for consultation and coordination meetings, and at least 2 known interactions between India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar and China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, the two sides have only disengaged at Galwan and Pangong Tso. So to discuss more about this, we have with us Manoj, Kewalramani, and Suyash Desai. So welcome to today's episode, Manoj and Suyash.
Hi, Ameera. Thank you.
Thanks, Ameera. Thanks for having me.
So I would like to start with you, Manoj, and I want to know, so we are in the 13th month of the standoff. So how do you see the situation on the border today?
Right. So what we know that's going on is essentially that both sides have dug into their positions largely, and there are still friction points that remain on which conversation has not happened for a while. The last Corps Commander talks, which was the 11th round of Corps Commander talks, took place in April. The statements from both sides after that, particularly the Chinese side after that, weren't really something to write home about. It wasn't the kind of statement that one would expect in terms of, indicating that there is reconciliation that's going on and the disengagement process is moving forward smoothly. All that has been achieved in the last 13 months is a tremendous breakdown of political trust on both sides. Along with that, disengagement along the Pangong Tso and along the Kailash range, the heights that the Indian side had captured. That the argument for that disengagement was essentially that troops were so close in eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation that a single spark could have led to another clash and probably more casualties. And then, you start going up the escalation ladder, which becomes difficult to control. And therefore, de-escalating from there or disengaging from there particularly was important. That's the argument from as far as we understand. Other friction points remain the way they are. Talks on them have dragged, like I've said. And both sides have sort of dug in, and at least the indications that we're getting from the Chinese side also and from the Indian side is that this is going to sustain. Chinese troop deployment hasn't gone down from the Indian side's perspective. There is reportage will tell you that there is an idea that we might be here for the long haul, and this might somewhat become like a permanent deployment, at least for the next 3 to 5 years. Because if you have to even disengage and de-escalate today, you will need trust to be built up over the years. You need to set up new protocols for, patrolling, and those protocols need to be played out in action, and they need to work smoothly. The frictions that arise in that sort of time period will then have to be addressed, and all of that is a lengthy process. So even if you start today, it's not something that's going to get resolved in the next month or 2 months. It's going to take a long time to get to where we were. That's sort of the best case scenario, that if you were to get to where we were. Also, one of the reasons why I feel the talks are not going to go anywhere is because both sides seem to have a very different understandings of how talks should proceed, right? The Indian side is saying that, look, we want to first disengage from the immediate friction points and then talk about broader de-escalation of the thousands and tens of thousands of troops that both of us have brought along and the artillery that's been kept and ready. And the Chinese side is saying, no, look, first let's de-escalate and pull back all the other stuff that you've brought about, and then we'll talk disengagement, which is sort of like putting the cart before the horse. It makes no sense. But they're doing this because they feel that they have a certain advantage that they want to nurture, which is why I'm quite pessimistic about how things will go down going forward.
So, Suyash, I'd like to get your thoughts on what you think is the situation on the border today.
Thanks, Ameera. I completely agree with whatever Manoj has said. I'll just add one or two quick points here. On the anniversary of Galwan Valley incident, I was going through Chinese literature, Chinese reportage on if they have published anything on this. I only found one article in the Global Times' Chinese edition. So there was nothing in the PLA Daily, there was nothing in the People's Daily. Manoj will know more about People's Daily. But one article from an expert working on India-China relations from Global Times Chinese edition said that I'm just paraphrasing, this is not the word, these are not the words that he has said, but I like to paraphrase it. Basically, he was saying that China is very much comfortable right now in the positions that it is holding, and looking at what has happened with Indian economy and the pandemic situation, Indian economy over the past 3-4 years and the pandemic situation over the last 18 months, it's very possible for China to hold on to this situation for a long term. And it's very difficult for India to hold on to this situation because the additional deployments that both the countries have done on the border is taking some cost. So there is war of attrition per se. So there are two things to this. This also goes back to what Science of Military Strategy was saying, and a cliched argument that India has been confined by you doing such things, that China is confining India to the continent. But up to a certain extent, that is true. And also it is a question to be asked that how long can we sustain? We can sustain, of course, defensive positions that we have held on the borders. But what if the other side what if there is two sides conflict, or there is escalation on both sides? Can we address such situations? So that is something that needs to be that needs some pondering going forward, I think.
Yeah. So, what, according to you, were the motivations for Chinese activities on the border? Like, were they tactical in nature or strategic in nature? And has China succeeded in achieving their motives in this standoff? I'd like to start with you, Manoj, and then Suyash, get your thoughts on this.
So I think let's first look at this, right? I mean, the Indian side and the Indian foreign minister has repeatedly said that, look, we don't know why the Chinese have done what they have done. And at different points of time, they've given us different explanations without actually giving us an explanation. So, and I think his comment was something like, we have 5 different explanations for what they have done. I think there was obviously a tactical and a strategic element to what they were doing. So the first thing to keep in mind is that this was not something that was done by stray soldiers who sort of, crossed over because of misperceptions regarding the LAC. This was obviously carefully planned, and this was thought through at the highest levels. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind, and I'll use the Chinese Foreign Ministry statement a couple of days ago, where it basically says that, look, our border deployments are normal defensive arrangements aimed at preventing and responding to the encroachment and threat on China's territory by India, which they call the relevant country. And they're saying basically that the Indian side has been increasing its military deployment along the Chinese border and encroaching on China's territory. Now, to me, what this basically tells us is that Indian infrastructure development over a period of the last few years has been a problem from China's point of view, from the PLA's point of view. That's because the more you develop in those regions, particularly road connectivity and so on, the more you are first, the more accessible the border becomes to you, and regions which are of tension can become more accessible. Secondly, the more you patrol those regions. The more you patrol those regions, the more likelihood of friction, because your patrols sort of coincide and you sort of engage far more than you did in the past. So that's one part of it, and I think that part of this effort was also to push back Indian infrastructure development. But that was sort of at the tactical level. At a strategic level, my thought is that this was an attempt at telling India that we are far more powerful. We are in a position to constrain your choices with regard to your policy, whether it's with regard to how you spend your defense budget, because we can make you spend money more on the continent as opposed to naval development. And we can constrain your choices in that regard. And we can politically constrain the government in that regard by creating this sort of pressure. Also, we can constrain your choices through this pressure with regard to your foreign policy decisions in terms of how far do you lean on the United States. And we can show you that, don't assume that your partnership with the United States will create some degree of support for you in this region. Here you are alone. And also, the more you sort of lean, the more we can sort of add pressure to you. The third thing is that you send a message to India's neighbors, which is about, look, this so-called regional hegemon can't take care of its own security. So, if you're thinking of sort of balancing what we want to do in our interests by balancing us against India, you need to think again. We are the top dog in the region, and we matter much more than we have ever. And you can look at this example to keep in mind. And think of this in the context of what happened in Doklam. And this is a message to the rest of the region also. Beyond sort of this tactical and strategic level, at a philosophical level, to me, China's actions stem from also a sense of understanding of Chinese power. And this is sort of an overemphasis and a hubristic understanding of, the fact that China has arrived and that it has risen and that it is a major power and it has this enormous capacity. And if you were a leader of a country that believes that there is this tremendous capacity to shape outcomes externally, then you would want to try and shape those outcomes externally, because what use is this power that you talk about if you can't achieve some of these goals? So you are becoming far more risk tolerant in exercising power. And where that's led the Chinese is another matter altogether, but I think that's one of the driving factors. And for people who read Chinese media and what the leaders are saying and the speeches and what's happening domestically, it's clear that there is a certain mood in the country about its position in the world, and among the leadership particularly, not the people, but the leadership. And I think that sort of has driven them at least to become far more risk tolerant, and which is what they have done here.
I would like to add to one or two things that Manoj has said. One thing regarding strategic and tactical drivers for China, if strategic drivers were what Manoj said, it should be questioned whether they are successful in achieving their strategic drivers. For example, the second point where Manoj pointed out that you can control China, there is a feeling that you can make India do certain things by doing certain things on the border. For example, if China's aim was to keep India, Manoj has not said this particularly, but a lot of commentary is around this, saying that China's aim was to keep India away from United States, then certainly this has not achieved. In fact, India has gone full swing towards United States. India is increasing its approach. India is increasing its involvement with the United States. We have signed 4 logistics pact at different levels, the fourth one being one of the most important ones. So that has certainly not worked out. Second thing, to add to all the things that Manoj has said, I feel, and this is a very personal view, I feel there is a realization per se that the mistake has been done on Chinese part, because there were multiple attempts of rapprochement over a past period of time. And this is because there is a realization. So if you remember 2020, we started with the standoff, and in July, there was a spike in activities. June, July, August, September, there was spike in activities on the eastern border, near Taiwan and in South China Sea. So having said that, even if there is a greater realization, which I completely agree to, within the leadership, that it's becoming one of the major global powers, if not the global power, but still sustenance of two-front activities, I'm not saying war or conflict, but two-front activities is very difficult for any global power, and certainly for China, because their logistics lines are stretched, which is a reality, though they are working on it from 2015. So I feel that there was a realization, though they are not saying it directly, but actions up to a certain extent have highlighted that there was a realization and a effort towards rapprochement. But it was not a complete effort, because that is why the troops were not taken back, because it was a face-saving attempt. By now, if troops would have taken back, it would give a certain different indication towards the populace. That's why troops were not taken back, and now we have reached at a certain threshold where they can sustain their forces. It's not that because there is status quo on both sides. This is a new status quo with no escalation. If there is an escalation going forward, then yes, China, India, I'm not talking about India per se, but China would face a lot of problems with escalation on both sides. But if status quo remains, then they are comfortable to deal with this. But if there is an escalation, then I think they are stretched on both sides. And that is why rapprochement had happened in between. We don't know where this. I also agree with Manoj when he's saying that this can go on for a very long time, because both the parties, at least China, is very comfortable in what they are doing right now.
Right, so if I can, Ameera, just sort of add to what Suyash is saying. So I don't agree with a lot of what Suyash said, and the reason that I don't agree with it is that I don't think that there was an attempt. So the one bit, let me just begin with what I agree with. What I agree with is that yes, Chinese action has led to India becoming far freer in terms of how it deals with the United States. And that is evident in terms of how we've approached the Quad subsequently. But at the same time, I mean, if you look at it from Beijing's point of view, it also is showing the limitations of how far India can go with the United States in some ways, because India has multiple interests to balance and multiple partnerships to balance. And Russia is a critical component of that. If you read Chinese commentators, what they are basically saying is that, yes, India has drifted closer to the United States' orbit, and that's not necessarily a great thing from their point of view. But they also recognize that, look, there are certain limitations as to how far India can go, with Russia being a key component. They also talk about, of course, the domestic debate and history of non-alignment and all that, which I don't buy into, because the domestic debate has shifted quite significantly. But I think that there is a really important point to be made in terms of the role of Russia and all of this, and the relationship between China and Russia and how close that is. And if we see through this standoff in Ladakh, Russia has played an important role in being sort of a negotiator between the two parties. In fact, Wang Yi and Jaishankar met in Russia, right? Which was a sort of first joint statement that we came up with regarding this particular conflict. I don't see any sort of rapprochement that's taken place. I think the Chinese have they've sort of gotten a sense that, this was, their objectives were limited. They've not necessarily succeeded strategically in in constraining India's policy. They've had some benefit, of course, because India is spending much more on continental defense, and that will strain India's resources. So there are some objectives that have been met. There are some objectives which have not been met. The biggest loss from a Chinese point of view is that they've essentially created long-term and, they've deepened that political mistrust and deepened the animosity that, some of those efforts that had gone into easing them. And they've sent India and the Indian leadership a very clear message that we are not happy with you rising, which again constrains what India and China can do in the future. But if you look at how Indian policy has been, right, we've sought to balance with regard to the US, but we've also tried to, make sure that we sort of deal with Russian annoyance, because the Russians are not happy with even this Indo-Pacific framework. At the same time, we've also participated in, through different means with the SEO, with BRICS. And if you read the BRICS summit statement that took place, the BRICS foreign minister meeting that took place recently, and the statement after that, and if you read the statement on multilateralism, multipolarity, human rights, India is echoing the Chinese line. So we are trying to carry out an uncomfortable balancing act. And the Chinese action puts us in a greater discomfort in carrying out that act. It requires greater resources, it requires greater balancing. So I think all in all, it's created a far more difficult situation for us to manage. That doesn't mean that the Chinese have achieved all their objectives. So that's how I sort of and look at this entire thing. And I don't see any attempts at rapprochement from the Chinese. They've offered support with regard to the pandemic, which is fine, and they've basically stuck to their broad line that de-link the border issue from the broader relationship, whereas India is consistently stuck to the line that we cannot do that. We cannot de-link the border issue because you can't have conflict at the border while we trade and while we, cherish the rest of the bonhomie of the 70 years of India-China ties. That's not going to happen. And that, again, tells you that the two sides are philosophically at odds in terms of how they approach the relationship. So therefore, I don't see any rapprochement happening.
Okay, so keeping in mind Chinese motivations and actions, as you and Suyash have already shed light on, I wanted to bring in India into the discussion, and I wanted to ask what you make of India's response to China on the border. Additionally, is there anything that India could have done, or is there anything that they can do?
From my point of view, what we could have done is we could have acted earlier rather than acting late. So there is a case to be made for whatever the chain of command and where the gaps sort of fell. I think there's a case to be made for us addressing that, because clearly we were slow in our response. And that's the first thing. And we should have anticipated, we should have responded, particularly with the kind of drills that were going on and the fact that we were monitoring those drills. So wherever that lapse lay, it's important to, and I don't think that's been spoken of enough. And I understand why not right now, but that those need to be examined. The second thing is that we need to realize that perhaps we need to spend more on defense. It's a difficult balancing act to be done given the tremendous priorities that the policymakers in India have, health, education, the rest of it. We need to spend on defense much more, and we can't be thinking of benchmarks like 2% because our threat perceptions are very different from, say, European or NATO threat perceptions. So we need to be spending much more on defense. We need to, irrespective of the constraints that we may have with regard to security or continental security, we need to spend much more with regard to naval modernization, because that's the space where we know Chinese interests are growing, and if we have an advantage there geographically, and we need to use that advantage and cement at least that position much more. I think in terms of the border, we need to anticipate that these sorts of the volatility is going to continue in the future. So we need to be prepared, whether it's greater induction of technology, whether it's investing in far more asymmetric tools of conflict, whether it's cyber. We need to do much more of that, because the wars of the future are not going to be fought just by infantry. So we need to invest in systemic tools for systemic confrontation, because that's also going to be a deterrent. So we need to do much more of that rather than just thinking about, how do we secure the border in terms of the land.
So the final aspect I wanted to bring into the discussion is regarding the nuclear dynamics between the two countries amidst the standoff. So there were reports recently of the DF-26 and DF-21 spotted near the border recently. And just before we get into it, for those of you who are not aware of what this is, the DF-26 and 21, or Dongfeng 26 and 21, the DF-26 is an intermediate range ballistic missile deployed by the People's Liberation Army, the Rocket Force, and the DF-21 is a medium range road mobile ballistic missile. So as I said, there were reports of these missiles spotted near the border recently. So what does this make of the nuclear dynamics between the two countries? Manoj?
I think Suyash is much more qualified to answer this question than I am. He studied China's nuclear forces in much more detail than I have at all. But the one thing that I would say is that, look, I don't think nuclear weapons is the threat of nuclear conflict or nuclear coercion. I don't think that's a component of the India-China dynamic at all. It's just the proximity of the two countries, the devastation that nuclear weapons can cause, the capacity of both countries, and what is the political objective that will be achieved by using these weapons. I think all of those reasons make it, to me, make it a, if not, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but sort of as close to as inconsequential in this dynamic. That is not to say that they don't play a role. I mean, they play a role in creating deterrence. They play a role in all of that, of course. But in terms of thinking of, using nuclear weapons to coerce, I don't really think that has a role to play in this dynamic at present, because it's not like either side is. Conflict between either side is going to be deeply damaging to both, even at whatever limited scale. Given where China's political priorities are and what India's political priorities are. So I'm not somebody who thinks that this is a big issue in the dynamic. They play a useful deterrent role. And nuclear coercion to me is just not something that is relevant in the sort of grand scheme of things, although it's not entirely inconsequential.
So I agree with Manoj when he says that effective deterrence needs to be created on the border. But we have, and these are academic debates. This is not very well discussed in the armed forces or practitioners. But for right now, we are based on punishment, deterrence through punishment. For example, when China comes and occupies a certain part in which India believes it's its part and in which India patrols, then India goes and occupies some other part which China patrols, and India believes it is its part, and China believes it is its part. So, which China traditionally patrols. So, India occupies that part, and then there is a bargain, and then they come to a solution. Demilitarized zone is created, and they don't patrol there for some time. This is how the standard operating procedure has been for so long, and after 40-50 years. We have realized that this is not going to work forward because the asymmetry is the power differential now is too much between the two countries. So we need to, our basic doctrine is focused on defense, but we need to build from punishment. We need to shift towards deterrence by denial. If we have, and that is because we have limited capability, limited money, limited defense budget. So we should invest in such tools which will result in understanding that gap, clearing that, limiting that gap of asymmetry. So investing more into surface to air missiles, investing more into a kind of infantry which will create denial. So these are just two examples. There are more examples like drone swarms, etc., which will create denial, which will at least create denial. Similarly, in the oceans, the kind of machinery or the kind of weaponry that we are investing in should be aimed towards denial so that we can limit the Chinese aggression activities or opportunism on boundaries and in the ocean. These are the 2-3 things that we need to consider going forward. This change, if we are going for this change, will not happen in 1 day or 2 day time. It will take 10-15 years from going from legacy instrument to this kind of weaponry. So for a long term, it's high time that India needs to focus on such kind of development, because China is going to stay here for a long time, and it's going to get more and more powerful if it continues on the same trajectory. And India needs to now pay attention to the kind of deterrence that it is establishing between two countries on border and in the ocean. I agree with Manoj partially when he says that nuclear weapon and nuclear strategy or nuclear threat would not be used for coercion. I completely agree with Manoj on what he's saying about this. However, but before that, just one point, one information point. The problem with DF-26 is that it can be used. For example, DF-21 has 4 different variants, 3 of which are conventional weapons and 1 is nuclear weapon. So identification can up to a certain extent be possible if we have a lot of time. In case of DF-26, that's not a problem. That's a problem because a same weapon or a same rocket can be a nuclear warhead or a conventional warhead can both be placed on the same rocket. So that's one of the major problems that the world is having with DF-26 regarding the ambiguity of the weapon. Now, I agree with Manoj where the coercion is not possible, but broadly, things are changing very rapidly. Just because of the kind of changes that are happening in nuclear strategy in China. For example, they're signing off new, and which are in response to the changes that are happening in US. So US first pointed out that we are modernizing our nuclear forces. Then they are keeping, their anti-ballistic missile weaponaries are being developed and placed with Japan and Philippines. So these changes China is reacting to these changes by maybe going towards launch on warning, creating more ambiguous weapons, internal debate about what the nuclear strategy should be. As a result of that, India could also perhaps start thinking about what it should do, how it can create more ambiguity. I'm saying these are the trends of possibility. These are not happening in India. Perhaps there was only one statement in 2016, but after that there is ambiguity regarding, or there has been no word regarding changes in India's nuclear doctrine per se. But generally nuclear things happen like this: one country, then second country reacts to the first country, then the third country reacts to the second country. But in case of both India, one good point in case of both India and China right now is that both are NFU countries, and that is what makes this dyad stable for now, at least. We don't know what is happening going forward, but largely and broadly we can say that the dyad will remain stable if ambiguity is limited. If so, for example, you pointed out one specific question: keeping DF-26 at Indian border. Such things create problems because of the nature of the weaponry. So, and as I have already pointed out, things are changing. We don't know how things will go on in the future, but right now the dyad is stable per se.
Okay, so on that note, thank you Suyash and Manoj for joining me on this insightful discussion on the Galwan clash.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ameera.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week. Thank you so much to Cred, CED, and Global Victoria. Without you guys, this thing would not be possible. So, on the note, Maruk Inayat gives us an overview of the potential Twitter ban in India. On this round is on me. Gauri Devi Dayal was joined by actor-producer Purna Jagannathan to talk about her career in Bollywood, Hollywood, and theatre. She talks about the upcoming season of the show Never Have I Ever. On Cyrus Says, we had legendary musician Usha Uttup. She took us through her journey and shared her experiences as the unconventional musician. In the second installment of the Father's Day special on Akla Station Adulthood, Ayushi has a candid conversation with her father, Siddhartha Meen. On the Global Victoria Tech Talks podcast, we showcase some compelling new tech stories coming out of Melbourne. Whether it's from the buzzing gaming industry or the robust edtech sector, Victoria is increasingly becoming a hub of emerging technology. And we talk to some thought leaders and industry legends about the same. Catch all the action from the World Test Championship on the Edges and Sledges podcast. For our Hindi listeners, we have Khel Niti, which goes live on YouTube every morning. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
We live in an age of disruption, of immense change in every aspect of work, life, and business. But is the old way of doing things truly dead? And are we ever going to stop saying the new normal? Join me, Varun Dugirala, on Advertising is Dead every Tuesday as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, creators, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond to dig a little deeper into how we got here, what we're doing now, and where we're headed. You can catch all the episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcast from.